Welcome back to On Air with Phoenician Hunter and 369 Lumineer, and welcome also to episode number 30, which is part one of our two-part series titled Cons-Piracy and the Case of the Missing Silver, where we dissect Phoenician Hunter's article of the same name. So welcome, Phoenician Hunter.
Hello, it's good to be back on air for another episode. Wow, we're already on
Number
episode
30.
30.
30, yeah. Well, we're
Jeez.
getting there. We're getting there thanks to our subscribers.
Yeah, and I just wanted to mention that too. A big thanks to all the new subscribers to this channel. Our last podcast, the Meeting of the Minds about immigration, resulted in some passionate discussions online and
Yes.
resulted in in an influx of new subscribers. So we'd like to say thanks for that, from the both of us.
Yeah, absolutely well said. And thanks for raising that. I couldn't have said it better myself. Look, we're relatively a young podcast. And so we obviously, as all young podcasters, rely on new subscribers to keep this channel alive, as you've mentioned. So we're ever so grateful. But today, look, we're going to, just for our listeners, a little bit of a synopsis. We're going to trace and again, based off the back of your research, how the control of coinage shifted from sovereign states to private hands and why that matters for the shape of the financial industry as we know and use it today. We're also going to discuss merchants, which you're quickly becoming the experts on merchants, the privateers, the mines, and the legal moves that rewrote essentially who gets to make the money. And yes, it's not the likes of you and me, but we'll dive into that a little deeper. So a quick question to our listeners to keep in the something that they can keep in the back of their minds as we dive into this topic. Do you think that money, as you know it today, is a public tool or a private lever of power? And this one's for you, Phoenician Hunter, to kick things off. Are we ready to follow the money where it goes, not where the flags necessarily say it belongs?
Yeah, good intro. I'll address those in due course. So the purpose of this two-part series was, to detail how we ended up with the current financial global model that we've adopted, and show when exactly and how it was adopted and who actually was behind it, because I've heard so many takes, but I wanted to do the legwork myself and see if what I was hearing was accurate. So, in this one, I referenced the monetary historian and expert Alexander Del Mar quite a bit. He seems to be the best when it comes to following the money, following coinage and the laws and all that. And we'll explain a bit about him later, and you'll see why he's the expert. And according to, his extensive research, the entire history of money can be divided into 5 distinct periods. All right, so I won't go through them all in detail here. Listeners can, always refer to the articles.
Sure.
So just briefly, the periods 1 to 4, which cover thousands of years, right? Money or coinage was always controlled, the prerogative of the monarchs or emperors or rulers or the state. Okay, so it had been like that since, the dawn of civilization, apart from the 5th period, and which is the period we are currently in at the moment. So this is a big deal because this is the first time in history that this changed. Money changed.
Yeah, thank you for that. And you said listeners to refer to your article. Just as reference, your Substack URL is phoenicianhunter.substack.com. Okay, let's continue. So I'd like to give a quick summary on who Alexander Del Mar was. Something short, something very sharp, okay? So he was an American political economist, and he was also a numismatist. And a numismatist is somebody who studies the collection of coins, tokens, paper money, medals, and other currency-related items. He was also a historian who spent decades researching the history of money and the institutions that essentially run it, which is why you've referenced him quite regularly in your article. So further to his background, he served as the first director of the Treasury Department's Bureau of Statistics in the 1860s. and later acted as mining commissioner to the US Monetary Commission in the 1870s. So this guy pretty much, knew his stuff. And I'm not surprised that you've actually referenced him. He also wrote extensively, and again, this
Yep.
is him backing himself up with titles like A History of Money in America and A History of Monetary Crimes, where he argued strongly against giving gold exclusive primacy as the monetary basis, instead calling for the remonetization of silver. Okay,
And we'll get into why that is the case a little bit later on,
of
and
course.
why he champions silver.
And I'm looking so
Yeah.
forward to that.
Okay.
Okay, so history lesson over. This fifth period you mentioned is known as the period of private coinage, where you quote Delmar. I want to read a specific quote in your article. This began when the goldsmiths and merchant adventurers chartered to trade with and pillage or conquer the Orient or the East, and obtained control of the royal privilege of coinage, and thus opened the door to private coinage. This period has not yet ended, as you made reference to earlier. So for me, if money becomes a privately managed privilege, who gains? Who loses?
Not the people.
Well, not the people, exactly. And practically, what does it mean for everyday people when coinage is treated as a merchant's right rather than a public means of trade?
Well, yeah, the result is that is the world we live in today. So, yeah, going back to what you're saying, Del Mar here is talking about, the period roughly from the late 1600s, all right? The time of the trade and exploration companies like the Dutch and East India companies, the Levant companies, the Moscow company, Virginia company later, all these companies were owned predominantly by merchants,
Yeah.
right? So this is when they became immensely powerful, right, at this time. And they controlled all the trade of the empires, all right? So this is important. But that wasn't enough. Now they wanted to extend that control to coinage as well. So they had the trade, the merchandise, and then they wanted to control, the flow and supply of money as well. Like I said, this is the first time that coinage was not controlled by the sovereigns or the state, but what they call individuals, private individuals. That's hence we get that term private coinage.
Yeah.
So these were the traders, merchants, or what we call today bankers. Bankers is more of a modern term. Back in the day, they were referred to merchants or money changers. Just a little bit of history here is required. Before Spain discovered America, and before the emergence or rise of the British Empire, Germany controlled the treasure and trade of the world. So not many people are aware of this.
No.
And predominantly German Jewish syndicates dominated the silver market, all right? They controlled the silver mines throughout Europe. And at this time, silver was the world's monetary standard. So if they're controlling the silver mines, they're controlling the supply of silver, and that's money. They're the ones in control of it at this time.
Okay, so if I can interject, for example, today the US dollar we know acts as the world's reserve currency, right? Yeah, we could also pose the question for how long, based on what's currently happening. But back then it was silver, and as you've just explained, Germany essentially held the upper hand, right? So again, I'm not sure if I'm going to phrase this properly, but are reserve currencies always about, let's say, a military dominance, or is it more about who controls the financial flows behind the scenes? That's part one of my question. Part two, what lessons can we take when we compare silver then with the dollar today?
It's really about dominance of the sea rather than military. But I mean, dominance of the sea will naturally extend to military power anyway.
Okay.
This is why the US, which is the current global power, has also the largest and strongest navy. It just goes hand in hand, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So, and before them, it was the British. And, we have discussed the power of, the sea, who dominates the sea and the navy in previous podcasts.
Yeah.
So when I talk about Germany here, I'm referring specifically to the Holy Roman Empire, or what was known as the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation.
Okay.
Okay. And its merchant class was the Hanseatic League or Hansa, and I think we've mentioned them before, or maybe not in a podcast, but
No.
for those interested in that, I have written about the Hansa and their influence on trade in a number of articles.
Mm.
I also briefly mentioned the term German Jewish syndicates,
Yeah.
and I'll come back to this in part two because that is a huge story in itself. And I got some questions about that from readers as well about what I meant about the German side of it, and that's a huge story, and it sort of opens up some other doors, and we'll leave that for part two. Now, what's very important to know is that when Spain discovered the mines of the New World, they actually depended on German finance and expertise because the Germans were the experts in mining,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Spain was relatively new to the methods and techniques, so they depended on them and also on their finance. All right, so which I wasn't aware of until I did some background research into this. So also at this time, the merchants or bankers for the British monarchs were also German.
Yeah.
So these were the German, as I mentioned earlier, the German merchants of the Hanseatic League, and they dominated English trade and in fact most of Europe's trade at that time. So they were the dominant merchants of the era, and they were the money lenders for a lot of the monarchs around the
Mm.
world, around Europe, and one of those were the British monarchs. And this is just before the rise of the British Empire, okay? Now, one of the things that happened were the local London merchants approached the monarch and said, listen, if you want to be more powerful and wealthier, you need to kick out these foreign merchants and rely on your own merchants. So now that's another story, and I've written about that, but that's what happened here. So the London trade guilds and livery companies are the ones that eventually take over as the monarch's bankers, and taking the place of the German Hansa League merchants at this time. So, like I said, yeah, I've covered that elsewhere.
Also, in your article, you mentioned, and this is a nice little bridging statement. You mentioned that once the New World was opened up, mining operations essentially shifted from Europe across to South America. So
Yeah,
between the 1500s or 1500 and 1800, Bolivia and Mexico, for example, together produced something like 80% of the world's silver,
yeah, massive.
which is something that people wouldn't necessarily be aware of. So Spain may have colonized the Americas, as we know, and as we've spoken about in previous podcasts, but the financing and the real control sat with Germany, as you've just described. Therefore,
Mm,
they essentially still controlled the world's currency.
yeah.
So, but my query here is how much power did financiers really have compared with kings and emperors? And I know that you're an expert in this area, so
Yeah, all right. So let's remember at this time, even though the mining operations were in the private hands of these syndicates, most likely owned by merchants and wealthy, German Jewish families, they still did not have the right to mint coins, okay,
okay.
or control, the flow of the currency. That was still, that rested with the sovereign still, right? Or the Holy Roman Empire in this case. So
Yeah,
they
yeah,
still didn't have, let's say, full control. So the financiers or merchants wanted that control for themselves. So this was like the logical next step for them, right?
right,
Over centuries of the playing that role of the merchant, they wanted more, so they wanted to be minting their own coins.
right.
And this was achieved, as I will explain, from the City of London. See, this was the British understood that if they were to rise and be, the most powerful empire in the world, this is what they needed to do. They needed to take control of the flow of money or currency, and at that time, it was silver. So,
Mm,
they planned this in advance. It was a long-term plan, and the old merchant banker philosophy, that I have found, especially since the turn of, maybe from the 1900s, they have this philosophy, and it goes something like this: they don't care who controls the land, the people, or the laws, as long as they can maintain control of the money supply. So,
Yeah.
it is their philosophy. It's something that they adopted, and I think we've heard it being quoted by famous people, that philosophy. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. And there's no surprises there with the City of London. And again, that's probably a topic on its own. But this
Yeah.
is where, for me, and this is a nice little timeline, this is where your article takes what I think is a surprising turn, and hence the title of the piece. It
Mm.
takes a turn to pirates, right? So
Yep.
those operating around the Americas, essentially. So
Yep.
I hadn't come across some of the details you revealed before. So for me, this was quite a revelation, which got me to dig deeper into other texts and so forth. So
Yep.
I think, and again, I just want to convey something. I think maybe listeners will be wondering the same thing I am. Were these pirates just rogue opportunists, let's call them, or were they in fact tied into the same financial and political networks shaping silver flows, as you've described earlier?
Yeah, I mean, they always paint the picture like they're opportunists or
Mm,
rogue
mm, mm.
individuals, but the evidence does not back that up. So, like most boys, I was always fascinated with pirates. I don't know about you, but
Yeah, same.
they make it so interesting, especially with a media, film, or whatever,
Yep,
books. The hunt for treasure and
yep, yep,
adventure and this sense of freedom.
yep,
Is appealing to most young men. And like pirates are also often portrayed as fighting against government or authority. They're sort of in it for themselves. Fuck it to everything else. But
yep, yep.
the reality is that's not how they operated. So when I looked into their activities closely, I began to notice, and I noticed this early on as a kid too, but I didn't put it together. I couldn't link that with the banking system or the conclusions I've reached now. So yeah, I began to notice that they weren't telling us the entire story, right? And who they really were or whom they represented and what their true motives were as well. Also, again, if you just look at it logically, how can a group of misfits, and if you see their backgrounds, they say, oh, they were ex-criminals or ex military, gone rogue, and how can they afford a large vessel, right? A large vessel. I'm not talking about a small little ship.
Yep.
A large vessel that could take on, the bigger vessels from the nation states, and fit it with cannons. I mean, that's not cheap, and keep it operational for years. You got to maintain it. You got to, repairs and apparently doing this all, hidden from authorities too. You're not rocking up to the warehouse store,
Yeah,
in London and saying, "Oh, can I have this?" Do you know what I mean? It
yeah,
doesn't
yeah.
make sense.
Of course,
And
yeah.
th- and then they're going up against the best and wealthiest nations like Spain, Portugal, Britain, France, for example. It's
Mhm.
it's like me telling you, a little group of Somali pirates are taking on, the U.S. Navy.
Yeah,
How it's
great
just
analogy.
ridiculous.
Yeah, good.
So no, these pirates in the Americas were actually, what makes sense is this: they were actually sponsored. They were sponsored by the British Empire and the City of London,
Yeah,
and this wasn't, even something that was that out of the ordinary because. If you recall, we spoke about the Barbary pirates of North Africa in an earlier podcast, where we showed that even those pirates, from North Africa were sponsored and financed. They didn't buy those ships themselves and man them themselves. They were financed by the Ottoman Empire and the Jewish merchants who
of
were
course,
who were kicked out of Spain,
of
right? And
course,
we,
of
we, we've
course.
discussed that in detail. So
And can I
yeah,
just interject, for our audience, if anyone wants to dig deeper into that connection we're talking about, that's podcast number 36, sorry, number 26, which is called Revenge on the High Seas, How an Alliance of Moors and Jews Avenged Their Expulsion. You can easily find it on this YouTube channel, On Air Podcast 2025.
yeah, it's the same method,
Yeah,
and that they always use. So Britain and especially the merchants, all right, based in the City of London, understood, right, that if they were to become, like I mentioned earlier, the world's wealthiest and most powerful empire, they would need at this time to take control, firstly, of the world's money supply, which was what? Silver, right? So that's what you got to do first.
yeah,
either take it themselves or destroy it or take it away from, their enemies, right? Because at this period, the 1600s, Britain was not yet the dominant power, right, in the world.
Yep.
You
Yep.
know, it was just an emerging power. So now, at this particular time, Britain and Spain were at peace, right? So the reason they used pirates was in order to conceal their actions, right? Because they didn't want to be blamed for, they didn't want to open a conflict with Spain. So they hired pirates or, what they call privateers to raid Spanish ships for their gold and silver. And I get into the details of that in the article. And I would imagine that, that state, the empire like Britain would have supplied the ships, the cannons, the weapons,
Of
and even the
course.
manpower, right? Because they would have needed expert fighters.
Yeah.
You're not going to go up against these military nations with, you know, your local,
Villagers and peasants.
exactly,
Yeah.
your local criminals. Sword fighting is, a skillful,
Absolutely.
practice. You're not
Uh,
going to go up
yeah.
against these
Can I
experts like
can
that.
I just add to what you've just said? And this is
Yeah,
again is off the back of your article that you note that most of the pirates at the time actually came from the British Isles. So let me lay out some figures for our
yeah,
audience that you've included in your article. So 47.5% were English, around 10% were Irish, 6% were Scottish, and 4% were Welsh. So put it together, that's roughly 68% or thereabouts
yeah,
from Britain and Ireland. So
yeah,
that's a huge majority, right?
yeah,
So
yeah,
which makes me wonder, was piracy, as you have, I think, alluded to earlier, less about rebellion and more about exporting British manpower into different kinds of
yeah,
empire building, for example? And how does this compare with the way Britain later controlled trade routes officially under the Navy?
yeah. I mean, that figure was the one that when that's how I came to the conclusion because I was looking at pirates and where they all came from.
Yeah,
And when I noticed that almost 70% of them were from the British Isles, I'm going, what?
that's
That
crazy.
can't be random. You know what I mean? That can't be random. So there's obviously a reason for that and a purpose, and there was, and it's because, like you say, Britain is exporting the manpower, and they're doing this covertly. This is a covert almost mission for them,
Yep.
right? So because they don't want to, they probably couldn't take on those other empires at this stage. They weren't powerful enough. The British Empire at this time wasn't powerful enough to take on the Spanish and the
Yeah.
Portuguese. So they did it this way.
No, it makes perfect sense.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, like I said, those figures just say everything. So they, who they were and who they represented. So I also read somewhere, right, that one of these raids was so massive that it almost bankrupted Spain. I mean, that's
Wow.
how big. We're not talking about, just raiding a little ship and taking a little bit of, silver jewelry or gold,
Yeah. Yeah.
massive, massive. It was like, almost bankrupted a nation
Gee.
state. So, and that was the purpose. That's what they were trying to do, right? So, and it wasn't only ships. These pirates, because like I said, I was into pirates, so I used to read a lot of stories about them. And these pirates also raided, Spanish-held colonies in the Americas. That's why they built all those forts, around Cuba and the Caribbean.
Yeah. Yeah.
They were organized, they had plans, military-style attacks. This was a coordinated, effort to take the wealth of another nation. All right. So then, once Britain became the world's number one power from the 1800s and had gained what they call command or control of the sea, this is when they started outlawing pirates
Yeah.
and yeah, and privateering.
How not surprising. Yeah. Yeah.
And yeah, and then they went on their mission to wipe out all the pirates in the in the Americas, because they're bad and evil. We must get rid of them, Yeah, because they at this point they're no longer required. They'd served their purpose, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So you find also this is a very common theme and tactic used by the British and in more recent years by the Americans.
Yeah.
So they'll use someone
Of
and
course.
then discard them when they're not needed and wipe them out,
Yep.
whatever.
Yep. For
Things.
those awake enough, people will understand this.
Pirates, pirates are like the merchants in many ways, right? And they were known pirates were known not to fight honorably or fairly. That wasn't their purpose. That was sort of the military style of doing things. I mean, that was another reason why they would have used pirates, right? Because there's no rules. You know, you can do what you want. If you need to, kidnap and assassinate, soldiers don't usually do that kind of stuff, right? So it makes sense they would use these people to do those kind of things. As a side note, something interestingly that the merchants who have placed humanity under maritime law have turned us into vessels for use on this commercial sea
Of course.
are also often referred to as pirates as well.
Yes,
You know, I think you've mentioned that too, like pirates of the high seas.
that's
Like,
right. Yeah.
and we've mentioned that in another podcast too, something to do with maritime law. Just before you go on, I just wanted to mention that this kind of stuff happens, it still happens today. So, to hide their involvement in activities, governments, what do? They hire mercenary or assassins, right? Or they'll hire another state to do something for them and say, "Oh, it wasn't us; it's these people here doing
Yeah.
it," right? So, usually to eliminate a target or achieve a certain agenda. It's nothing new. Just because it happens today. It's happened in the past as well. Nothing's new. These
But
tactics aren't new.
and particularly, as I said, for those of us who are awake, we can see right through this. So,
Yeah,
but for those who want to understand maritime or admiralty law, you mentioned that we said in an earlier podcast, it was in fact episode number 17, which we titled Aboard the Citizenship. And I highly recommend this one. I'm actually quite passionate about this particular topic. So, episode
yeah.
17.
Thanks for that. I forgot what the episode was. Yeah. So
That's okay. So, look, getting back to silver, and that's as I said, a good little history lesson on piracy. You make the point that the silver standard meant that I don't know, a unit of account fixed to a weight of silver. Okay, so you have something; it's fixed to silver, and that's how they determine the worth. So historically, silver was actually far more widespread than gold, and we know from research that from around 3000 BC up until the late 1800s, this was the case. So really, for most of recorded history, let's say, silver was the monetary backbone. So, a question for you: why do you think silver held that role for so long? And in your opinion, what finally tipped the balance in favor of gold?
yeah, good question. Before I answer, I just want to let everyone know I'm not a monetary expert. Okay.
Well, I certainly
No, no,
understand that. No,
I'm just looking at like I investigate the merchants and I can
of
just see
course,
their shenanigans and their role behind the scenes, behind the powers behind the monarchs, with them influencing politicians, changing laws, you know, that's what I follow. So,
of course,
okay, so it's important to understand that it was much easier for the wealthy and the bankers to control the supply of gold because few can afford it in large quantities, right? So it's much more difficult to control silver as there is more of it and it's in smaller quantities and it's spread across, more channels. So that's why it's harder to control silver. Okay. So the reason gold was chosen, it's not because it was any kind of better values, but it was to take silver away from the people, right? So the bankers understood that they could hoard the gold for themselves, right? And because, like I said, they can afford it, and by making silver worthless, by demonetizing it, it became of little value, right? So to the people, and it took away their purchasing power. So, that's the way they eliminated it, basically. Said, oh, people can say, oh, we've got all the silver. Yeah, but we're making it worthless. So it doesn't matter at that point. You can have as much as you want. It's worthless because they've made it worthless, you see.
the old switcheroo.
Yeah, and there's an old saying that goes, gold is the money of the wealthy and governments, and silver is the money of the people. They've
Right.
known this. It's an old, saying. So that's the reason for it.
Well, you also, and just to back that up, the first official US currency wasn't in fact gold; it was the silver dollar. and that came with the Coinage Act of 1792.
Yeah, exactly. So from the very beginning, I believe the founding fathers understood this. They understood the value of silver, and it allowed for freedom from the bankers. And at that time, 1792, like you point out, silver is still the monetary standard. So they're not deviating from it. It's these bankers who do that later. So at that time, like America, the whole of the Americas, South and North, was rich in silver mines,
Mm.
right? And the law at that time, with that act, allowed one, allowed a person to mint their own coins, right? They could mine silver
Mm.
and mine their own coins. So this gave the American people financial freedom.
Yeah, well, from my understanding, anyone could, with any silver, could take their bullion to the mint. They'll get it struck into back then full legal tender silver dollars, and they could then use
Yeah.
it freely to pay debts, taxes, trade, etc. Now, as
Yeah,
you're
so obviously they couldn't allow that, right?
Of course, because as you've written, this was a direct threat to bankers, right? And it's no
Yep.
surprise to us. So let me paraphrase the line in your article. The national banking powers in New York and London couldn't control the silver dollar so long as its free coinage was law. So a massive conspiracy was hatched to end it all.
Yeah, and that's why I was mentioning earlier. I look at the merchants and their behavior, and it's usually, they're doing their shenanigans with the changing
Yeah,
laws,
yeah,
changing. That's the way they operate. They influence politicians, so yeah,
yeah.
to get what they want.
So look, here's the reflection for me, right?
Right.
When a currency resists any sort of monopoly, does it become inevitably the target of those who want to monopolize it? And secondly, the second part is, could free coinage ever return in today's system?
Mm, wow. Well,
I'm putting you on the spot. You don't necessarily
yeah,
have to
yeah.
answer it in this
All right.
session.
Obviously, the bankers can't allow that,
Mm,
right? And see, the money power centered in the city of London, which is what I trace the money power to, at this time. Okay, it
yes,
wasn't
yes.
always. This is important. It wasn't always centered in the city of London, but
Mm,
in this particular, time period in history, that's where it was centered, right? They deliberately planned the destruction of silver as money, and we didn't get into all the nitty gritty and the sources and the references here in this chat because they're in my written works, right?
sure, sure.
So we need to remember that in the 19th century, Britain's pound sterling was the reserve global currency, right? So just like you mentioned earlier that the US is the reserve currency.
Yeah,
Back then it was Britain, so they ran the show, which they took from the Germans, right?
yeah, yeah,
So they had control of everything, the trade and the wealth of the world, just like I mentioned that Germany did before, right?
yeah,
So
yeah.
in 1821, Great Britain moved away. So that's how early it was. 1821,
Mm,
right, is when Great Britain moved away from the silver to the gold standard. So that was, pretty much gained, as soon as they became like the sole global power,
mm,
they're
mm.
already thinking about the money, the system. We need to change that.
Yeah,
Okay. But see, what people need to understand is when other nations were the global power, like Spain and the Dutch for a time, Portugal, all these people had reserve currencies at one point or another, right?
sure.
But they didn't change it. They kept it silver. Britain is the first ones to change it, right? In the
Yeah,
modern era. They're the ones who change it. Once they get the upper hand, that's the first thing they do, or
of
almost the
course.
first thing they do.
Yeah,
Okay, this is what's important because they wanted to make it private. That was the first step. All right. Demonetizing silver is only the first step, and we'll continue because it's a two-part series, and I'll continue in it, and you'll understand how we got to the current system of which is our debt-based system, which is pretty
sure.
much backed by nothing today.
Nothing, nothing. Yep.
But it works in steps. They had to follow these steps in order to get to where we are now, right?
Right.
So going back to what I was saying, they moved to the gold standard in 1821, right? And
Mm,
then introduced it into their colonies afterwards. So Australia, Canada, they had a lot more colonies back then. Africa,
Yep. Yep.
wherever,
Yep.
Asia even too,
Yep.
wherever they were, right?
Yep.
So then by the 1870s, which is like 50 years later, most of the world also adopted a gold standard. So, you know, it took 50 years, but then because they were the dominating power, so they could influence and dominate everyone, right?
Yep.
And America followed suit in 1873 with the 1873 something act, Coinage Act.
Coinage Act. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's when they demonetized silver, then, right? So back to your question, I don't think free coinage of silver will return because I believe we're heading firstly towards digital currency
Okay.
or
That's clear.
um, digital transactions,
Yep.
which is just numbers on a computer, really. What are people doing today? Just tapping their phones.
That's
They're
right.
not even using bloody credit cards anymore.
Cards anymore. Yep. Yep.
See, yeah, that's the other thing. Cards are gonna soon they're gonna
Yep.
disappear as well,
I'd be
right?
taking my shares out of any of those card manufacturers, as in the physical cards, those
Yeah, good
printers that,
point. Yeah,
yeah.
actually, good point. I mean, yeah, it's just the way it's gonna go.
Yep.
Yeah. Plus, silver today has become, too valuable as an industrial metal. It's used in computers, chips.
Yeah.
Um, unless that changes, that could change. If a new technology was invented, that doesn't need silver for the chips or whatever. But at the moment, silver, the way it is at the moment, silver's too valuable as industrial metal. So, taking silver away from there, from industry and putting it as money, is just not feasible, I don't think.
Okay.
And, that's the thing. We don't really know what metal or resource may become useful and necessary in future. Like, with what do you call it, electric cars and
Sure.
batteries now, they're mining other minerals that they wouldn't have needed 50 years ago.
That's right.
So yeah, we don't
Well,
know.
this obviously leads up to what you mentioned, the Coinage Act of 1873, and I think in a lot of modern texts, it's often referred to as the crime of 73.
Yeah, but that's what it was.
Yeah, essentially, of course, it was such nefarious activity. It's you've got to sit
Yeah,
back and wonder, right? So it removed the US from silver and locked it into a single gold standard.
yep,
So this, if any of our listeners are on YouTube or TikTok or anything like that, and if you had the patience, there are some content creators out there that dive deep into the crime of 73 and the current monetary system. But that again is for our listeners and our subscribers' own research. But it sort of makes me wonder what you've just taken us through. Is this shift that you've mentioned about, is it about economics, or is it about consolidating control into the one percenters, the elites, the fewer hands?
I don't think it was ever really about economics.
Mm, mm.
It's about control. And they wanted to gain control over the coinage, right, and its supply. Yeah, at the end of the day, it's about control and power, right? So, and I'll cover more about that in part two,
Good,
okay?
good.
But we're focusing here on silver, how, yeah, okay. So this act um, was achieved mostly by the one I'm talking about, the act in 1873
73,
in
yep.
America. Yeah, it was achieved mostly by, the bankers bribing the American senators,
Oh, surprise,
the
surprise.
old they use the old typical playbook. There's nothing new, right? Right. So
The old lobbying trick, as they say. Yeah.
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 This is before the days of APEC and the
Yeah, that's
ADL.
right. Oh
But see,
God,
this is the thing. Everyone's focusing.
that's another tangent we can easily go off on,
Yeah,
but we
but like
won't. But
everyone,
we won't.
everyone
Let's.
focuses on that.
That's
Back in
right.
the day, it was
Yeah.
it was British. It was the British lobbying. So
Yeah.
the
Wow.
ADL of the time was British based. It was based in
Wow.
London. So
Jeez. Okay.
who knows where it'll be tomorrow? It might not be
Yeah.
Israel. It might be someone
Wow.
else.
Gee. Okay.
Yeah. So, the old typical playbook is, bribery first, then, it's threats and lastly, assassination, if you don't go along with their plans. That's the old bankers tricks.
Yeah.
So now, we won't run through them all here. But in my article, I do reference and quote a number of researchers and historians who expose not only England, but the City of London as the primary instigators of these monetary policies, right? And a name that keeps coming up is the Pilgrim Society, as
Um,
you've heard of them before, because
I'm
we've
glad
mentioned them.
I'm glad you raised that because, and sorry for interjecting here. I'll let you continue in a moment. But the Pilgrim Society, again, I first found out having read your articles, and this was one of our earliest episodes. It was episode number two,
Right.
which we did, which was called the Pilgrims Secret Society. And again, I encourage people to go have a listen to that. Our podcast techniques might not be up to scratch as they are today.
Yeah,
We were just starting out. It is episode number
those early
two,
ones are
after all.
shocking.
Oh well, they're okay. They're information laden, which is fine. But for me, context matters here because it ties the monetary shift into the same networks of influence that
Yeah,
straddled both sides of the Atlantic. Let's call it right. So
exactly.
you've mentioned the Pilgrims. Would you say that they acted more as a coordinator or coordinators of policy, or the beneficiaries of it?
Well, okay. So, firstly, I think the Pilgrims represented a combined. All right, they were a combined British and American wealthy families, right? Who were not only out to sort of gain power and extend their wealth, they were also loyal, right? This is important. They were loyal to the British monarch and the idea of an extended or expanded British Empire. Okay, with the British's ambition to become the sole global empire, which in some ways I think they have achieved this through the use of the modern United States, right?
Right. Yeah.
And I have discussed this in other articles, and so have other researchers that the British Empire, what we see today with the American Empire, is really the British Empire gone global.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, so it is an extension, it's an evolution of that
Of
idea of the
course.
British. And this is what the Pilgrims wanted. This is what they represented. So they were the combined British and American, you know, oligarchs, I guess.
Yep.
Is it
Yep.
right? Okay.
Yep.
Now, a few Americans, back in the day also understood what the bankers were trying to do, you know, and one of those was, as we've mentioned, the historian Alexander Del Mar.
Mm,
And he was very hostile to the gold standard, as I think you mentioned earlier, and
that's
wanted
right.
recommended a return to silver because he understood its value, and he understood what the consequences would be, with this new policy being implemented by the bankers.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and in your article, you also note that in around 1877, Delmar, he was appointed the mining commissioner to the US Monetary Commission. I alluded to that earlier. And that commission was created in 1876, so the year prior, after US Congress realised the extent of the trickery that surrounded silver's demonetisation.
Yeah, see, they must have known what was going on. It's
Right.
it's like today when there's something, even with COVID, right? Remember after COVID, then there was like, I think it was Ron Paul or something, who were asking questions. They have those kind of inquiries
Of
where,
course, of course.
what the hell just happened?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And the thing is though, what comes out of it? Nothing ever
Absolutely
fucking, they
nothing.
achieve nothing.
Yeah,
They just
nothing.
have their little say in front of the mic.
I think it's more to appease the public, the masses. We see it everywhere, all around the world.
I
And
think
one
you're right.
one thing that's relevant to us being expats of Australia, there's all these royal commissions that happen in Australia
Yeah.
that nothing comes of it. Okay,
No.
so it's more to appease the masses. Anyway,
You know,
sorry, go on. No, go.
Yeah, no, you know what I think it is also that as public officials,
Yeah,
they're required to answer those questions because they
right.
they get questions given to them by the public. Like you can write you know,
To a senator
to a
or
senator and
yeah.
then say, hey, listen, and if they get enough, they have to address
Oh,
it,
by
even though
law
it
they
doesn't
need to.
go
Okay.
anywhere.
Yeah,
It's a
yeah, yeah.
bloody, it's just theatre and
Yeah,
show. But
yeah, okay.
yeah, I think that's what it is.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay. Well, look, let's come back to what we're talking about. So 3 years earlier, after Congress started asking questions, 3 years earlier, what they call the Panic of 1873, they had already come and gone, right? And some would argue, and again, I'd like your view on this, that some argue directly that this happened directly because silver was sidelined in favor of gold, which you've just taken us through the entire history of it, right? While others point to, railroad overbuilding and banking failures. Again, that's a typical excuse
But
to
see
pass the
again,
buck. Yeah,
if you take the money, the silver, you're taking the money from the people.
that's right.
So it's going to affect everything. Their purchasing power is gone.
That's
You
right. That's
see?
right.
Yeah.
Oh, look, either way, whatever
Yeah.
the case was, Del Mar and others believed that monetary manipulation was central to this whole
Yep.
exercise, right? So again, I'm going to ask a question that can relate to most economic crashes in history. Was the panic a manufactured crisis? We can talk about the panic in 1929. Was it a manufactured crisis to force change, or was it just again, I'm being very, very easygoing here, an accidental consequence of this new standard? And I know which theory I'm leaning toward, but
Yeah, there's no consequences, mate.
yeah, yeah, exactly, exactly.
So, yeah, it's quite obvious that, panics and depressions are caused by, those who control the money supply. Any honest, monetary historian will say so.
Mm,
Um, I've mentioned I did an article, and I think we've recorded a podcast on it. Britain Regains America, where they purposely instigated all these crashes, one after the other, until they convinced, Congress that they needed a central bank.
right.
So we have discussed that issue in
Yes.
another podcast.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah.
Britain Regains America, that one's called.
Yeah.
Okay, so after its investigation, right,
Yeah. Yeah.
the commission recommended a return to silver. So that was their recommendation,
Right.
but it was ignored because by this stage the bankers had paid off most of the
Of
senators,
course. Of
and
course.
the same old story. These are the same methods used today. Like we said, they have these commissions. They don't go anywhere. You know.
It's all this what do they call it? Smoke and mirrors.
Yeah.
That's the what I wanted to
Look,
use.
once they change the laws and stuff, it's really.
It's very hard to go back.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Look, okay, I think if you would agree, it's probably we're leaning towards the end of part one of what we wanted to discuss today. We don't want this to go on for too long, but again, another great chat. I really enjoyed this, but before we do sign off, maybe a few final words from you. Perhaps what's the one thing you want our listeners to carry with them until we come back with part two?
Yeah, okay. I'll just keep this brief. Yeah, my final thoughts are, we didn't just arrive at our current economic system by chance, okay? It was a deliberate and long-term plan, spanning, like we said, centuries. From if you can even from the time that the pirates were raiding, the Spanish silver. So, it's taken a couple of 100 years for them to plan this out, and achieve their goals.
Yeah.
And they've probably got other goals now that, we're unaware of that, extend into for the next 100 years. So yeah, the first step, obviously, by the money power or bankers based in the city of London, as we said, was to terminate the private coinage of silver, right? Taking it away from the people. So this was achieved globally by 1870, with everyone adopting the gold standard. And next they plan to put an end to that also. Okay, so because we need to understand that when the gold standard came in, we didn't have it for very long. It was less than a century. Okay, and I discuss that more in detail in part two, because that's the topic for that piece is gold and
Yeah.
and how they moved away from that very quickly.
Yeah.
And I also touch on again that German element that people who read my piece asked me about, who's this German element, and that might surprise some people too.
Yeah.
It's not who
Well,
you think it is, and it's
yeah.
yeah.
Let's. That's a good little closing statement there, because it'll keep people on the edge of their seats. Thank you very much. Look, what we can say with confidence, is that contemporaries like Del Mar obviously saw a pattern. Legal changes, financial interests, and institutional powers working together to concentrate money control, essentially. And that's the narrative you're tracing in your research, and I think it's fantastic. And it's worth testing against archival evidence and primary sources. So one final question for listeners to hold on to until part two is, when the rules about money change, and you've clearly outlined that over the last, 45 minutes or so, who gets to write those rules? And have we, as citizens, allowed the privilege of coinage to drift from a public function into a private franchise? And that's the question that I opened up with in our intro. So we would love to hear our subscribers and listeners' thoughts. Comments on the Phoenician Hunter Substack channel are always welcome. They're open, phoenicianhunter.substack.com, and he does respond to all of them. So once again, thanks, Phoenician Hunter.
Thank you for your time again.
Another great chat. And don't forget, subscribe if you haven't already done so on this channel. And please check out the archives for all the past episodes that eventually tie into each other. So
yeah, they do.
Until part two, as we always say, continue to stay curious. This is Phoenician Hunter and 369 Lumineer signing off.